Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another day of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and I'm so excited that we get to connect this morning, and we're going to explore lots of really cool things today. Today, our program is called Habitats, and what we're going to do is we're going to compare and contrast two different habitats. So what that means to compare and contrast is we're going to look at two different habitats, and we're going to talk about what is the same and what is different. And we'll even start by defining that word habitat so that we're all set as we explore. But before we get into that, I do want to give you a way for you to communicate with us. So I'm here live in the studio, and I've got my friends Sam and Sergio, and they're helping control everything you see behind me. And Sam just put up this number. So if you want to share your observations, so things that you're noticing or you're seeing, if you have any questions, if there's animals that you want to talk about, or if you just want to say good morning to us, we always love hearing from you. And you can go ahead and text us at 562-286-1838. And that's if you're watching live. Now, if you're watching after the fact, so it's later in the day, maybe not the day that we're airing this on Tuesday, you can go ahead and email us at live@lbaop.org. So these are both ways that you can reach out to us. We love to hear from you. All right, everyone. Now, I said we're going to start exploring. We're going to compare and contrast two different habitats. But I want to start really basic with what that word habitat means. Now, I am standing in front of a habitat here, but there are lots of different habitats both on land and in the ocean. So if you know what that word habitat means, you can go ahead and text us. We've got that text number up. If you are watching in class, you can raise your hand and maybe share with your teacher, or with your teacher's permission, turn to the person next to you and share what a habitat is. If you're watching at home, you can share with anyone you're watching with, or you can even think it in your brain. What is a habitat? Or what does that word habitat mean? It's a good word. We talk about it a lot here at the aquarium. Anywhere there are animals. Oh, we've got that word right here, habitat. So what is a habitat? So the way that we define habitat, I'm going to step off so you can see this habitat. The way that we define habitat here is a home for animals. Is that what you said? Excellent. Now, there's lots of things that can make up the home for animals, but it's everything that goes into building that home or that community for an animal. That is a habitat. Now, when we talk about the ocean itself could be a habitat. That's a really, really big habitat. But if we dive into the water and we kind of start looking around and moving around, you got to move around quite a bit to get to different habitats. But if you move around the ocean, there are actually different habitats because there's different places animals live. And in those places where animals live, there's different things that help them survive. And some animals need certain habitats, and other animals need other habitats. And then some animals might even move between habitats. So if we're looking at this habitat here, this is a kelp forest. This is going to be the first one we're going to explore. There are animals who live here, and all their needs are met. So all the things that they need to survive, food, shelter, mates, all can be found in their habitat. If that habitat doesn't support those things to help with their survival, animals might move to another place where they can find those things they need. So when we look at a habitat, we'll be able to find sort of all those things that an animal needs to survive, because that's why they live in this space. Now, some animals like really small habitats. Some animals need lots of space to move around. Every habitat might look different, but they all provide for those animals. So let's dive in, as we say, and let's start exploring our first habitat. So I mentioned this is a kelp forest, and the first thing I want to do, and if you've ever watched any program with us, with either me or any of our other team here, we talk about observations. Now, I love using observations because it's a tool that scientists use. And I'm including all of you watching as scientists, because you are scientists today. Whenever you join us, you are a scientist. But observations are such an easy tool for scientists to use to help them to study a space. Because you don't need any equipment for observations. You also don't need to have any prior knowledge. So maybe you're really familiar with a kelp forest, especially if you live here in Southern California. But if this is a brand new habitat for you, you can still make observations. Because when we make observations, we are just describing what we see. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes. And again, you can share with the person next to you, raise your hand, think it in your brain, share with an adult you're watching with. What do you notice in this habitat? Observations could be colors. They could be shapes. It could be living things and non-living things, because there are both of those needed to make up a habitat. It could be animals you recognize. It could be behaviors or movement, what you see those animals or things doing. All of those are habitats. All of those are observations of a habitat, because we're just looking and describing what we see. And if you want to share with us, remember you can go ahead and text us at 562-286-1838. So while you're formulating your observations, I'm going to share with you some things that I noticed. Now, this is an interesting view of our blue cavern habitat. That's our exhibit here, because our camera is up at the top. And you might notice that up in the corner, it says highlights, which just means there might be something, some work being done on our camera. So we're not watching it live, although we usually do. And these days, our camera is lower down in the exhibit, but I think this is a really cool view. It's kind of like a bird's eye view looking down, as if we're snorkeling rather than scuba diving in this exhibit. But I noticed there's lots of movement. Did you notice that too? Lots of animals moving around and different sizes. Like if we look right here, these fish right here look pretty small compared to like that animal, a big shark. And there were some bigger fish that we saw. Oop, even that one's a bigger fish over there. Bigger compared to these ones down here. And then I did see some really big fish too. I also see some rocks. Did you notice some rocks? So it kind of lines the habitat here, but then in the middle, there are some rocks here. I also noticed this plant-like thing that's kind of waving in the water. And it's kind of different colors. There's some right here, kind of a brighter green. And then there's this stuff here. It's maybe like a darker green, almost like an olivey brown. And then there's even some other colors right here. Oh, there's those two big fish as well. And it also looks like there's sand down at the bottom. So we've got rocks and sand. We've got this plant-like thing. We've got fish of different sizes swimming all around. I think that's some pretty good observations. So now that we've made those observations, I want to talk about some of the things that we noticed. So first things first are those rocks. A lot of times in habitats, there are non-living things that sort of create the structure that creates the basis of this habitat. So for our kelp forest, those rocks are really important because they're going to be a place for that kelp, which makes the kelp forest, to anchor to. So we've got these rocks, which are important because this kelp, all this plant-like stuff, is going to hold on to the rocks. And that's how it stays secure to create that forest. Now, that kelp or that plant-like stuff is kelp. And kelp is actually not a plant. It's plant-like, so it's very similar to a plant, but there are some differences. Now, I'm going to have Sam bring up a picture of what a kelp looks like sort of from the bottom all the way up to the top. So it's going to be all the different parts of the kelp. So here's kelp in the natural habitat out in the open ocean. And we can see it's moving, and we can also see something really important. Sunlight is really important to kelp. But I want to get the picture that shows sort of the full piece of kelp, and we'll talk about the different parts and how it's similar to plants and how it's different. So one of the big similarities which we can see now is I mentioned that sunlight. So plants on land, like the trees in your community, flowers, grasses, they all need sunlight to photosynthesize. Basically, they take the sunlight, they convert it to energy, and that helps them grow. Excellent. So this is a great video. Kelp also needs sunlight. So they photosynthesize in the same way that plants do. So that's a similarity. But this picture shows a big difference. So if you think about those grasses or plants or trees, maybe in your yard or in your community or at your school, they have roots. And those roots are really important because they dig into the soil or the dirt. They help anchor that plant in there. So if it's windy or there's something moving around it, it doesn't get ripped out of the ground. It also helps them get some nutrients. So it helps anchor them and also helps them get nutrients. Now, algae, like kelp, they don't have that root system. They have something called a holdfast. So it does kind of look like roots, but they're exposed. And rather than digging into the sand or the mud or the ocean floor, it actually holds onto a rock, which is why those rocks are really important, because this is how kelp is going to anchor and stay in place. Now, they don't get any nutrients from that rock, but the way that roots for grasses and flowers hold them in place, the holdfast helps that kelp stay in place. And then the kelp is going to use that sunlight, and they're going to grow towards the sunlight, keep reaching all the way up to the top. Now, kelp can grow about 60 feet tall or 60 feet deep, but it can't grow much more than that because of that sunlight, because the farther down in the ocean you go, the less sunlight you'll see. And the less sunlight means there's less chance for them to get energy. Oh, here we got a good picture of our kelp forest. So we can see all of it. We've got the sun up here. We can see really how tall this kelp is. And then we've got that holdfast down here. Now, each part of that kelp forest makes homes for animals, is a habitat. So the kelp forest is a habitat as a whole, but this holdfast is a habitat for some animals. So tiny things like little crustaceans, like little crabs and little shrimp, little worms, lots of small animals will make their home in this holdfast because it's harder for larger animals to kind of get in there because it's all this kind of tangled root-like structure. And so it's a good safe place for them to live. And then there's some animals who hang out in the middle. And then there's animals who use the canopy or the top of the kelp forest for their home. So the kelp forest as a whole is a habitat, but there are animals who live sort of throughout that use different parts of the kelp forest in different ways. Now let's focus in on one animal that lives in the kelp forest. Let's go back to that giant fish we were looking at before. We'll get a picture of that giant fish that lives in the kelp forest. Excellent. So this is called a giant sea bass. And the name giant definitely applies to them. They can get about 6 to 7 feet long and weigh like 400 or 500 pounds. So they are very large fish. Now we have 3 of them here at the aquarium. And if you visited us, you can see them in our blue cavern exhibit. They aren't full grown. So they look big, but maybe not as big as they can be. But these are really amazing and large fish. So let's make some observations about the giant sea bass. I'll have Sam put up that lower third again. So if you want to let us know what observations you notice about the giant sea bass, you can go ahead and text us. What do you notice? I think one of the things that stands out the most are the spots, right? They've got spots covering their body. Now in this picture, it kind of makes the fish look blue. In reality, they're kind of a grayish, brownish color, and those spots are black. This picture just happens to be the way the lighting was and the color, and in the ocean, this is a sea bass out in their natural habitat, so not one photographed here at the aquarium. Just made it look kind of blue. But in reality, they're pretty gray with those dark spots. But they definitely have this really cool spot pattern. I also noticed their mouth, right? They've got a really big mouth. So their mouth starts here, and then it opens all the way to here. So their mouth can open really wide. And when they eat, they just kind of suck up their food. It's almost like a suction. They just kind of pull the food into their mouth. Now, most fish, giant sea bass included, they don't chew their food. They don't really have flat molars or flat teeth like ours that help grind their food. And so pretty much they're just bringing their food into their mouth, swallowing it whole. They do have some extra organs inside that help them break down their food more than we do because we use our saliva and our teeth to break down their food, or our food. But they are swallowing most of their food pretty much whole or in large chunks. What else do we notice? I also noticed their fins. So fish have fins to help them swim. But what's really cool to see is the large broom-like tail of giant sea bass. Look at how long and wide this tail is. And that's going to tell us that they can be pretty strong swimmers. Now, when we see giant sea bass swimming, they move pretty slow. They're a pretty slow-moving animal. They've got a lot of sort of weight to carry around with them. And they don't really have a need to swim very fast because they don't have a lot of predators in the kelp forest. They are one of the largest animals living in the kelp forest. So they're one of the top predators. But they can take off with like bursts of speed, and that really large tail helps them. Now back to that spot pattern, because we've made some observations. That spot pattern is actually really important for helping us study giant sea bass. So that spot pattern is unique to that fish. So these spots we see here, if we were to look at another giant sea bass, we won't see spots in the exact same place on any other fish. It's kind of like our fingerprints. If you look at your fingerprints and you look really closely, you can see little designs. That's your fingerprint. And your fingerprints are unique to just you unless you're an identical twin. Then you have the same fingerprint. But if you're not an identical twin, which I'm guessing most of us aren't, you have unique fingerprints that are unique just to you. So no one else in the world has the same pattern of all of your 10 fingers. And that's just like the giant sea bass with their spot pattern. So we can photograph a giant sea bass, kind of notice where their spots are, take a picture of another giant sea bass, see if they're the same or if they're different. And that helps us study giant sea bass if we go diving in a place and we dive over and over and over and over again and we encounter giant sea bass, we can see if we're seeing the same or different ones, which helps us kind of get a picture of the population of this animal. Now, the spots also help the giant sea bass. So that's how the spots help us. But they also help the giant sea bass because of where they're living. So they tend to be towards the bottom of the kelp forest. You can kind of see there's like rocks and other algae down here. They tend to live near the bottom of the kelp forest where there's lots of shadows because that sun is shining down, but it has to shine through all of that kelp. And by the time it reaches the bottom of the kelp forest, there's lots of shadows and there's less light and it's harder to see things. And so those spots on the giant sea bass do help it blend in or camouflage because it kind of breaks up, helps them kind of hide in those shadows. Now, I could even challenge you, if you look in this picture, there is more than one giant sea bass hiding, which you may not notice because that color pattern helps it hide. But if you take a look right here, we do have a second giant sea bass, just its tail hanging out in this image. Excellent. All right, so we talked about the kelp forest habitat and one of its inhabitants, about the giant sea bass who lives there. But let's switch gears and look at a different habitat. Because remember, we're comparing and contrasting. So now we're going over to a tropical coral reef, different kind of habitat. And let's look and think about what is the same and what is different. Are there any similarities? Now, this is a completely different habitat that is found in a completely different part of the world. It's all still in the Pacific Ocean, believe it or not. Pacific Ocean is very large. There are many habitats in it. But whereas that kelp forest is one of our local habitats that we have right here, we call it our ocean backyard if you're here in Southern California, coral reefs are in tropical water. So you have to take a plane and go somewhere like Hawaii or Palau, which is where our exhibits are designed after. So somewhere tropical where there are coral reefs. So are there any similarities between coral reefs and kelp forests? Or is it all differences? So go ahead, take about a minute. What do you notice? Let's make some observations. And you can kind of think as you're making those observations, are they some of the same observations you made for the kelp forest? Are they all different? What do we notice? Now, one big thing I noticed, and I bet you noticed it too, is the colors. There are so many colors here in this coral reef, and so many different colors, brighter colors, a lot more than we saw in that kelp forest. In the kelp forest, there was a lot of blues and greens and browns, maybe some sort of like pinkish a little, but here in the coral reef, we've got yellow, we've got pink, we've got purple, we've got silver, we've got black, we've got orange, green, we've got a whole rainbow of colors, and it's both the animals and some of the structures we see as well. What else do you notice? Now, we are looking at a smaller habitat, and that doesn't mean that coral reefs are smaller necessarily. We're just looking at one of the smaller exhibits we have. But something to notice is there's a lot more fish, and they're all around the same size. They're a lot smaller than the fish in the kelp forest. And in coral reefs, we tend to see a lot more fish, but they all tend to be smaller. Now, that's not to say there aren't large fish living in kelp or in coral reefs or in kelp forests, but we see almost more diversity of fish here, but they're on a smaller size. What else do you notice? Now, there's something I see that is a similarity between the coral reef and the kelp forest. One is there's fish, right? There's fish in both of them. That's pretty common. I would say that's a given. In most habitats, you will find fish, but I bet there's some places in the ocean that have less fish than others. But something I'm noticing, maybe you noticed it too, there are rocks. Now, there are other structures in a coral reef, but if you look like right here and up here and even sort of back here, there are rocks in this coral reef. And that's because those rocks are really important and they serve the same purpose as the rocks in a kelp forest. They anchor. Now, they're not anchoring algae in a coral reef like they are a kelp forest, but they are an anchor for corals. Did you notice any corals in this habitat? It's a coral reef. I've been naming it that. So I bet you've guessed there are corals in here. But there's a lot of different kinds of corals we're looking at. There's coral here, coral here, coral here. This is coral up here, back here, right here. So there's lots of coral diversity here in this coral reef, but all of those corals are growing on rocks. So rocks create a hard surface for the corals to attach to, just like rocks create a hard surface for the kelp forest to attach to. Now, the way that we talked about kelp as being sort of the building block for that habitat, coral provides the same role in a coral reef. But corals are an interesting thing because a lot of times people think corals are rocks, or maybe they might think they're plants, but in reality, corals are animals. Now, it may not look like it here, but they are alive. And here is a close-up picture or video of coral polyps. So coral is what we call a colonial animal. We think about it like an apartment building. Maybe you live in an apartment. I live in an apartment building. So I have my unit where I live, but then there's other people who live in the same building. I have neighbors, but it's all one structure. So whereas some people might live in a house and that's just one building, there's nothing attached to it, it's just a house. Other people live in apartment buildings where there's other houses or other units attached to them. And that's kind of like a coral. So a coral is a bunch of little animals living all together. And here are all the individual polyps. So each individual little coral is a polyp. And you can see they've got these little wiggly things. Oh, that was perfect timing. Almost looks like a breeze rustled through there, but that's the water current. Those little tentacles help them get food. So one of the ways coral eats, and I say one of them because there are two ways that coral can get food or get energy, is all these polyps have these little tentacles, and these tentacles do have tiny little stinging cells in them. And that helps them catch any food that floats by. And what floats by are going to be tiny little plankton animals, tiny little itty bitty things that are really hard for us to see, but those tiny little tentacles are going to be able to catch it. Now, in coral reefs or in tropical waters, the water tends to be really clear. And what that means is there's not a ton of things floating by. So there is some plankton, but there's not enough plankton for the coral to get enough food. So they will get whatever they can using their tentacles, but corals also have a helper. So inside each of these polyps, there is an algae. Algae. Now, we talked about algae in the kelp forest, right? Because kelp is an algae. And there is algae that lives in coral reefs. Very different algae, different sizes, different color, two different things, but algae nonetheless. So the algae that lives with our corals are really tiny. Here you go. All these little green specks, these are little bits of algae. Now, algae, as we mentioned with the kelp forest, photosynthesize. So they use the sunlight to get energy. And so having this algae living in the coral polyps, that is another way they get food. So they're able to get food from two sources, from pulling food with their tentacles, and then also from using the sunlight for energy. And those two combined, working together, feed the coral enough that they're able to grow. And all those individual polyps will grow. And for some corals, like those ones that look like rocks, they create a structure around them. So the polyp is on the inside, but they create this hard structure on the outside, and that's how we get those sort of rock-like structures. Maybe we can take a look at one of those coral reefs where we can see those hard corals. Excellent. So this is another exhibit that we have here. And you can see both some of the hard coral. So like, look at this one right here. So this is one piece of coral, but it's not one animal. It's a bunch of tiny little polyps, so each individual animal all living and working together to build this structure. And that's the same with this one over here, and this one up here, and then this one right here, all of these. And then what's cool is you can see this one that kind of floats. I kind of think it looks like little fingers kind of floating. This is another kind of coral. It just happens to be a softer coral. So not all corals build that structure around them. Some of them build other kinds of structures that are a little bit softer and they move a little bit more in the water. All right, now that we've got the basics of this habitat, how it's the coral, let's take a closer look at an animal who lives in the coral reef, and one I bet you might be familiar with. As I mentioned, coral reefs have an extreme amount of diversity. So there's tons of different kinds of fish. Coral reefs actually cover only a couple percent, like 1 or 2% of the world's oceans, but they have about 25% of the diversity. So the different amount of animals who live in the ocean, a lot of them live in a coral reef. And this is one of them. Does this one look familiar? Yeah, these are clownfish. Now, we call them clownfish or anemone fish, and I'll explain why. And they kind of look like a fish you might be familiar with, although these ones might look a little bit different. So clownfish is a general term. We call them anemone fish, and there's different types. These, I believe, are called Clark's anemone fish, but they have those same stripes that you might be familiar with. Now, these animals are also called anemone fish because they live in, you guessed it, in anemones. So clownfish or anemone fish, both the names work, but we like to call them anemone fish because of where they're living. So you can see that these fish are swimming in and out of this animal here. And this animal is an anemone, a sea anemone. Now, if you live here in Southern California, you might be familiar with sea anemones because we do find them here in kelp forests, in the tide pool, locally, but they also live in coral reefs. So here's a anemone that you might see here if you come to the aquarium. This one is called a fish-eating anemone. What do you think it eats? Ah, you got it. It eats fish. Some anemones eat fish, some eat shrimp, other little planktonic things that float by. But this is an anemone you might see more locally to us here in California. But anemones can be found in both habitats. So there's another similarity. Some of the animals we see might be similar. Now, those clownfish or those anemone fish, they live in and around those anemones. We can go back to their picture or the video of the clownfish. Ah, excellent. So you can see this is a picture of another anemone fish living in an anemone. Now, this one is obviously different colors. So anemone fish come in lots of different colors. We saw the sort of different pattern, different kind of oranges of that Clark's anemone fish. This one is pink with one stripe. Sometimes we'll see, or we have had here at the aquarium, black with a yellow stripe. One of my favorites are called skunk anemone fish, and they're actually a similar color to this one. And you can kind of see they have this stripe down their back. It's kind of like a skunk, right? Skunks are black with that white stripe down their back. And skunk anemone fish have a white stripe going down their back. I think they're really cute. But back to living in an anemone. Now, if you are familiar with anemones, you know that they protect themselves in a very special way. Anemones are relatives of jellies, sea jellies, jellyfish, who sting themselves as a way to catch their food and to protect themselves. And anemones do the same thing. So each of these tentacles, these ones you see here, they all have stinging cells in them. And anytime anything touches them, they're going to fire that stinger. And that's how they protect themselves from any predators who might want to hurt them. But if we see this fish doesn't look like it's being harmed by the anemone, and those other clownfish were swimming in and out of the anemone with no problem. And that's because they have a special adaptation. Now, we haven't quite mentioned that word yet today, but we talk about adaptations a lot here at the aquarium. And adaptation is something on an animal's body that helps it survive in its habitat. So while its habitat provides for it, some animals are specialized to live in their habitat. Excellent, we've got that word adaptation. It's good to see it. While the habitat provides for the animal, animals are sort of built to live in their habitat. They are specialized, and some of the things on their body are specialized for that habitat. So while clownfish or anemone fish, their habitat is a coral reef. Their very specific habitat, on a smaller scale, is an anemone. And their adaptation, they can live in an anemone, is putting slime on their body. Now that might sound kind of gross, human, right? We don't want to be covered in slime. But actually most fish in the ocean have a layer of slime on their body. And that actually protects them if they rub up against a rock or get any scrapes or cuts. That slime helps protect them from getting any infections. The slime on these clownfish or anemone fish, however, is even thicker and it's specialized. So when they swim in and out of the anemone, they don't feel the stings from the anemone. Anemones don't have brains, so they can't think, I'm going to sting you and I'm not going to sting you. They're going to sting whatever touches them. But these fish have that special layer of slime, so when they move through the anemone or in and out of it, they don't feel the stings. And that way they have a special home. The anemone protects these fish because other animals who might try and get to the fish in the anemone will get stung. And then in return for that protection, the anemone fish will clean up the anemone. Anemones, not the cleanest eaters. And an animal who doesn't move very much, there's going to be a lot of animals moving above them, dropping bits of food and things. And the clownfish or the anemone fish can help clean it up to make sure that they stay nice and healthy. So they work together. They have this relationship where they both help each other. I also think they're just really pretty fish to watch. I love these clownfish. Excellent. All right, let's go back. Maybe let's go to our big trop. So our largest exhibit here at the aquarium is our big tropical exhibit. But it is a coral reef. So coral reefs can be really small areas, but they can also be really large. So this is just one exhibit here that is a smaller coral reef area. And you can see there's lots of spaces for animals to live in and amongst the coral in these sort of rock crevices. But then coral reefs can be also really large places. And you can see there's lots of different types of coral. So not only is it a colonial animal, but it also lives in and amongst other kinds of coral. So this is our largest exhibit here at the aquarium. It's the coral reef. And here you can see some of the other diversity, larger fish. We've got some sharks hanging out in here. We've got stingrays. Really cool exhibit. And I recommend that if you want to check in on our animals or keep exploring habitats, go ahead and check out our webcams. If you go to our website and you scroll down towards the bottom, there is a box or a webcam. And we have cameras in a lot of our exhibits that are different habitats. So you can take that kelp forest at Coral Reef. You can look at a penguin habitat. You can look at where jellies live. Doesn't make much of their habitat, but it is a place or a habitat where some animals live. Excellent, everyone. I encourage you to keep exploring. I hope you do, scientists, but that is up for all the time that we have today. So I'm going to say goodbye, and we hope to see you again next time. Bye, everyone.